productivity. Chapter 5. First-order effects of race differences in cognitive ability. In this chapter and the next, I limit myself to the first-order effects of race differences in cognitive ability and violent crime. By first-order effects, I mean those that are directly related to the measured race differences, and that we know without doubt are occurring. In this chapter, I present evidence that the job market hires Europeans, Africans, Latins, and Asians with markedly different cognitive ability for the same occupation. That's a first-order effect of race differences in cognitive ability. It's happening, for whatever reasons. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? That's not a question that lends itself to without doubt answers and is not a topic here. I should add that this chapter could easily be extended into a long book. Cognitive ability is associated with many personality and behavioral traits. Populations that differ in cognitive ability will also differ to some degree in those traits, with wide-ranging though usually minor effects. Why cognitive ability is important in the job market? Many traits help explain why some people are better at their jobs than others. Personality traits such as empathy and simple agreeableness are examples. Even more important are traits such as self-discipline, conscientiousness, and persistence. In combination, such traits sometimes explain as much of the variance in job performance as cognitive ability does. IQ is not everything. Cognitive ability is nonetheless important in the workplace, and not just for a few intellectually demanding jobs. You have probably observed this for yourself. In elementary school, you probably had good teachers who engaged with their students, getting the material across and then motivating the students to explore it. You probably also had bad teachers who became defensive and hostile when students asked questions. The difference would have been partly a matter of personality. But another reason was that some teachers were smart enough to deal with students' questions, and others weren't. You have likely noticed how some waitstaff in a crowded restaurant can cope with the hectic pace, while others mix up orders and can't keep track of which tables need what and when. Part of the explanation is how smart they are. The good ones are dealing efficiently with queuing problems. Many of you have had small children for whom you chose nannies, or elderly parents for whom you chose home care providers. In both cases, your priorities in selecting among job candidates were probably warmth and conscientiousness, but you also undoubtedly worried about how candidates would respond to an unexpected problem. You were trying to assess how smart they were, because being smart enough when an unexpected problem occurs is an essential part of the job. If you worked at menial jobs in high school or during summers while in college, you found at firsthand that even the most menial jobs can be done well or poorly, efficiently or inefficiently, for reasons that involve cognitive ability. What you have observed in your own experience with the world is common knowledge to employers. Competence matters in every occupation, and cognitive ability is part of the explanation for competence. Not surprisingly, recognition of that fact has led to an enormous amount of research about the relationship of cognitive ability to job productivity. The technical literature is so extensive that the chapter on cognitive abilities in the most recent edition of the Oxford Handbook of Personnel Assessment and Selection is not a meta-analysis of existing studies. It is a review of many meta-analyses. The consistent findings about cognitive ability and job performance that apply most directly to group differences in cognitive ability are these. Measures of cognitive ability and job performance are always positively correlated. The size of the correlation goes up as the job becomes more cognitively complex. Even for low-skill occupations, job experience does not lead to convergence in performance among persons with different cognitive ability. For intellectually demanding jobs, there is no point at which more cognitive ability doesn't make a difference. Increases in IQ scores are statistically associated with increases in productivity at every level of cognitive ability. You will find brilliant performers of every race in any occupation. That doesn't negate the relevance of these considerations to group means. The magnitude of the relationship of cognitive ability to job performance varies. Magnitude in this case is usually expressed as the correlation coefficient between IQ and a measure of job performance. A correlation coefficient goes from 1 a perfectly inverse relationship to +1 a perfectly direct relationship. The square of a correlation represents the percentage of the variance it explains. Rules of thumb are that the correlations between IQ scores and job productivity for low-complexity jobs are seldom below. For medium-complexity jobs, they are seldom below. For high-complexity jobs, they are seldom below. Correlations of this size are too small to determine how well a given individual performs. Even a correlation of explains only 25% of the variance, but they are more than large enough to make cognitive ability an important element of an employee's productivity from the employer's point of view. If you're an employer and want to know whether it's worth the trouble to give cognitive tests to job applicants, information about the correlation of IQ and productivity for a specific occupation makes it a straightforward matter to calculate the dollar value of hiring someone with an IQ of 100 versus someone with an IQ of 115. The difference might be too small to repay the bother of administering even a short written test. It may be large enough to warrant repeated interviews to assess an applicant's intellectual strengths. I am not contending that a few points difference in IQ among employees is important. Rather, if one race in an occupation has mean cognitive ability that is conspicuously different from the mean cognitive ability of another race in the same job category, in the same workplace, there are consequences for the productivity of an organization and also for the interactions of employees. Another consequence is the generalizations that people will draw from those differences. In what follows, I document the existence of large race differences in cognitive ability in specific occupations. But first, I will describe the ways in which the educational pipeline works to promote those differences. The educational pipeline. For jobs that require a college degree, race differences in cognitive ability in the workplace should be minimized by the process of obtaining that college degree. But it hasn't worked that way since at least the 1970s. Colleges have been complicit in transmitting the mean IQ differences by race in the general population, not only through the college pipeline, but through the graduate education pipeline as well. Undergraduate education. There is no reason that the means and distributions of cognitive ability in universities need to be different for Europeans, Africans, Latins, and Asians. If admissions committees made their decisions without knowing the applicants' races, all of those groups on a given campus would have roughly the same means and distributions on the SAT or the ACT. Not exactly the same, but in the same ballpark. That would be true of students of different races in the Ivies, flagship state universities, second-tier universities, and small colleges. There would be no basis for covert jokes about affirmative action students, because it's not just test scores that would be similar across races. So would performance in the classroom. The cost of implementing such a policy is that fewer African and Latin students would be at the most prestigious colleges, but that cost would be counterbalanced by the greater presence of talented African and Latin students at other colleges. Young people of all races would be admitted to colleges where they were fully competitive with their fellow students. This would be apparent to everyone, with wonderful effects for authentic mutual respect among students. Yet admissions offices everywhere insist on having enough minority students, with the result that race differences in mean cognitive ability in the general population are replicated on campus. Universities do their best to hide what's going on. They refuse to reveal mean SAT scores by race, proclaiming that everyone we admit can do the work. What they don't acknowledge is that the admitted African and Latin students, as groups, will be concentrated in the bottom of their classes, and that the people making the admissions decisions know it in advance. Occasionally, sunlight penetrates the darkness. The biggest leak occurred in late February 1993, when Richard Herrnstein, a professor at Harvard, and my co-author on the bell curve, arrived at his office one morning to find that someone had anonymously left a copy of the Red Book on his desk. At that time, the Red Book was produced annually by the Consortium on Financing Higher Education, which consisted of 16 out of the top 20 universities and 5 of the top 10 small colleges, as ranked by U.S. News for 1993. It was the university equivalent of leaking a top-secret CIA document. The Red Book contained the mean SAT scores by race for each of the schools. The median edge given to African applicants at those elite schools was about 180 points on the combined SAT, equivalent to approximately 1.3 standard deviations at the time. A larger gap than separated Africans and Europeans in the general population. Someone with an SAT score 1.3 standard deviations below the mean is at the 10th percentile of the distribution at those colleges. We published the school-by-school information in the bell curve. Nothing seems to have changed since then. We don't have a current version of the Red Book to work with, but testimony in the recent case charging Harvard with discrimination against Asian applicants included evidence that the same profile of test scores, GPA, and extracurricular activities that gave an Asian applicant a 25% chance of admission gave an African applicant a 95% chance and a Latin a 77% chance. This phenomenon wouldn't be important if it were limited to the elite schools, which admit a tiny fraction of all undergraduates. But universities draw from the talent pool in a hierarchy. African and Latin students with combined SATs in the 1500s are admitted everywhere they apply, but they tend to accept the most elite school on their list. Harvard, Princeton, and Yale have a lot of extraordinarily talented minority students, and they thin out the pool for the next schools in line. Even without a Red Book, it is easy to guess what then happens throughout the system. We can use a combination of two indicators, both of which are available in the U.S. News rankings of universities: the percentages of African and Latin students in the undergraduate student body, and the SAT scores for the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles of admitted students. Here it would be misleading to use the IQ metric because students who take the SAT and the ACT are self-selected for cognitive ability. They all want to attend a selective four-year institution. I am switching to Z-scores, which represent where the racial means fall on the distribution of 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds who take the test. Recall from Chapter 3 that Z-scores are expressed in standard deviations, and that a standard deviation of 1 is equivalent to 15 points in the IQ metric. The scores for both the SAT and the ACT match closely with the national estimates for Europeans, Africans, and Latins presented in Chapter 3, while Asians score well above their national estimate. That is, the SAT and ACT differences in means are about the same or greater among college applicants than they are in the population as a whole. One implication of these results is that the raw numbers of African and Latin applicants with the minimum qualifications required for entry to an elite school are small, and that is indeed the case. For practical purposes, European and Asian applicants to elite schools need at least 1,500 on their combined SATs, and well above that for the top tier, roughly the Ivies plus Stanford, Duke, MIT, Caltech, and Chicago. The College Board declined my request for the data that would give me the precise numbers, but the published breakdowns allow for reasonably accurate estimates of how many students of each race get 1,500 or higher on the SAT. The numbers of test takers with a combined verbal and math score of 1,500 plus were around 900 for Africans and around 3,300 for Latins. Meanwhile, the numbers for Europeans and Asians with scores in that range were about 27,500 and 20,000 respectively. The result is that a large majority of Africans and Latins, with combined SAT scores in the 1500s, are swept up by the top tier. The rest of those top-scoring students, and a large majority of those who score in the 1400s, are in the next dozen schools in the U.S. News or Forbes rankings. Ergo, many fine schools within the top 50 universities have virtually no African students with scores of 1,400 or above, but still have large numbers of European and Asian students with scores not just in the 1400s but in the 1500s. Many good universities below the top 50 have no African students with scores as high as the 1300s, but some European and Asian students with scores in the 1400s and 1500s. Too, like the elite schools, they want to have a racially diverse student body. The result is a cascading propagation of a large difference in the mean cognitive ability of African, European, and Asian undergraduates, all the way down the line from elite schools to ordinary ones. The same dynamics apply to Latin applicants, but not as severely. Applications to professional schools. Table 5 below summarizes recent test scores for students who want to go into one of the professions by way of a medical degree, law degree, MBA, or PhD. For practical purposes, everyone who wants to get into one of these programs takes the Medical College Admission Test, MCAT, the Law School Admission Test, LSAT, or the Graduate Record Examinations, GRE. I show the Z-score of the average applicant on the major test used for the professional field that the applicant wants to enter. STEM refers to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The average difference between Europeans and Africans on these tests was larger than the IQ difference in the general population. The same was true of the Asian and African comparison. In contrast, Latins taking these tests had somewhat smaller differences with Europeans and Asians than Latins in the general population. In terms of percentiles, Africans are in the bottom quartile of test scores for all the admissions tests except for those heading to business school or graduate school in education. The Latin scores are all in the second quartile, at the end of the pipeline. One hopeful possibility remains. The admissions committees of graduate programs might cull the admitted pool so that the racial test score gaps among those who actually matriculate are modest. Or perhaps the dropout rates mean that the people who eventually get PhDs, MDs, and JDs are much closer in ability than the applicants. The data for directly testing these possibilities are limited to medical school. Matriculation in medical schools. The people who administer the MCAT are unique in reporting not only the test scores of the applicants, but also the test scores of those who are accepted and matriculate. Here are the results for 2019. Not much happened between application and admission to affect the differences. The European-African difference was reduced slightly, while the European-Latin difference increased. The Asian differences from the other three races all increased. U.S. Medical Licensing Exam, USMLE. This examination is required for admission into most residency programs. Step 1 of the USMLE measures whether the test taker can understand and can apply important concepts of the sciences basic to the practice of medicine. It consists of 7 60-minute blocks administered over an 8-hour period. In effect, it is an exit test from medical school. Below are the Step 1 Z-scores for 10,541 applicants to residency programs during 2014 to 2015 at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra-Northwell on Long Island, New York. The race differences on the USMLE are noticeably smaller than those for matriculants to medical school, though they remained substantial. Asians no longer had the highest scores. The European-African and European-Latin differences were just 0.6% for and 0.45 standard deviations respectively. These results indicate that medical school does in fact eliminate the weakest students. I return to this issue when I discuss the evidence from professional certification tests. Observed differences in cognitive ability within occupations. We now turn from inferential data to the observed cognitive ability of people who are employed in various occupations. The question itself is simple. What's the mean IQ of Europeans employed as electrical engineers? High school teachers? Plumbers? What are the comparable mean IQs for African, Latin, and Asian electrical engineers, high school teachers, and plumbers? Finding databases to answer the question is hard, however, because it requires analyzable sample sizes for individual occupations, which implies a study with large sample sizes and also a good measure of cognitive ability. The three such datasets that I found are the 1972 National Longitudinal Study sponsored by the Department of Education and the 1979 and 1997 cohorts of the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth sponsored by the Department of Labor. The three cohorts combined give us 20,203 Europeans, Africans, and Latins whose occupations in their 30 seconds and 40 seconds are known, as are their scores on a G-loaded mental test that they took in their teens or early 20 seconds. Unfortunately, the number of Asians in these studies was too small to provide reliable estimates of IQ for specific occupations. The results you are about to see are based on persons who were born from the early 1950s through the early 1980s, people who as of 2021 are ages 37 to late 60s. As you will recall from Chapter 3, the narrowing of the European-African gap occurred in tests administered from the late 1970s through the mid to late 1980s, which in most cases involve people born before the early 1970s. Thus, the members of the samples tested in 1972 and 1980 were born when both the European-African and the European-Latin differences were higher than they are now. The European differences in the 1972 and 1980 surveys were 1.29 and 1.24 SDS, respectively, while the Latin European differences were 0.99 and 0.93 SDS, respectively. The sample tested in 1997 showed a smaller European-African difference of 0.98 SDS and a smaller European-Latin difference of 0.67. You should keep this in mind when you look at the numbers in Table 6. They accurately reflect the profile of the labor force for the last few decades, but the IQ differences among the younger members of the labor force are typically a few points smaller than the differences among the older members. IQ differences in ordinary jobs. Comparatively few people are physicists, physicians, attorneys, or work in other high-prestige occupations, which means that even a sample of 20,203 includes too few in such occupations to provide analyzable samples by race for them. But the three studies do have enough people in more normal occupations to do so, and the sample weights used by the studies enable us to reach estimates that are representative of the national population, so I can return to using the IQ metric. Table 6 below shows mean IQs and the sizes of the race differences for 9 familiar occupations ranging from cognitively demanding, accountant, to a low-skill job, janitor or building cleaner. They are a selection from a larger set of occupations for which data are presented in the online documentation. I have ordered the occupations by the European mean IQ from highest to lowest. With just one exception, vehicle mechanics, all of the European African differences are greater than the 0.85 SD national estimate from Chapter 3. The mean difference is 1.15 SDS. The differences for registered nurses, K-12 teachers, and childcare workers are especially large. The European Latin differences are closer to the estimated national difference of 0.62 SDs, with an average over all 9 occupations of 0.79 SDS. Table 7 below expands the power of the analysis by grouping occupations that are filled by people with similar IQs. For example, the combined samples do not have enough African or Latin physicians to provide reliable estimates, but combining them with other occupations that draw from people with mean IQs above 115, college teachers and lawyers, for example, increases the samples to usable sizes. The IQ groupings in Table 7 are based on the European mean. Categories below 100 are all blue-collar jobs, ranging from unskilled to highly skilled labor. The 100 to 104 category includes occupations for which the European mean was at least 100 and less than 105. Examples are preschool teachers, police, and electricians. Examples of occupations in the 105 to 109 category are registered nurses, secretaries, and social workers. Examples of occupations in the 110 to 114 category are accountants, clergy, computer programmers, and engineers. Examples of occupations in the 115 plus category are physicians, dentists, lawyers, and college teachers. The mean IQs of Africans and Latins increase with each higher category, just as the European means do, but the size of the difference generally keeps pace. In the case of the European-African difference, the size of the difference tends to increase along with IQ, from 1.01 SDS for occupations with European mean IQs under 100 to 1.20 SDS for European mean IQs of 110 or higher. Why are employers ending up with workforces in which the differences in cognitive ability are so large? The answers probably vary for different occupations, illustrated by some of the occupations in Table 6. Janitors and building cleaners. For unskilled occupations, a substantial part of the difference is a statistically predictable phenomenon. It occurs when almost all of the population is smart enough to do a particular job. The races have different IQ means, and employers also value non-cognitive qualifications such as reliability. This explains much of the 13-point difference between European and African janitors. As the cognitive demands of occupations increase, the importance of that statistical phenomenon drops. For occupations of greater complexity that have a lower bound IQ requirement near 100, only a small proportion of the differences in Table 6 and Table 7 can be consistent with a fair hiring process that ignores race. Childcare workers. One plausible explanation of the large European-African difference of 1.55 SDS is that non-cognitive traits such as warmth, reliability, and being good with children become extremely important in choosing a childcare worker, and outweigh considerations of cognitive ability. Another plausible explanation is that the requirements for being hired as a childcare worker vary by the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. In neighborhoods with affluent and highly educated parents, nannies and preschool programs are supposed to provide cognitive stimulation to the children, a priority that can reach comical heights in high-status neighborhoods, where getting one's children into the right preschool is seen as the essential first step for getting them into Princeton. The result may be that the cognitive requirements and the pay for childcare workers in affluent neighborhoods are far higher than they are for childcare workers in poor neighborhoods. Registered nurses and K-12 teachers. The European African differences are 1.49 SDs for registered nurses and 1.35 SDs for K-12 teachers. Part of the explanation is probably as simple as demand outstripping supply. Shortages of nurses and teachers mean that hospitals and schools don't have the option of being choosy. But another plausible explanation involves a potentially good thing, a certification requirement, in combination with the way that anti-discrimination employment laws are administered. To become registered nurses, graduates of nursing schools must pass an examination, usually the NCLEX-RN. In almost all states, K-12 teachers are also required to take examinations which vary by state to be hired as teachers. The granting of certification is typically based on pass, fail with no gradations. You either get your certification or you don't. This is appropriate for establishing a minimum level of competence, but it means that the people who pass the test represent a wide range of performance, from the barely qualified to the superbly qualified. If they could, most hospitals and most school systems would presumably want to choose the most qualified, but to do so would leave them vulnerable to lawsuits and investigation by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission if the people they hired turned out to be disproportionately European. This is not the place to describe the murky jurisprudence surrounding the use of tests in employment decisions. The online documentation has a summary. An employer cannot be certain that hiring people with the highest scores on a certification test will cause trouble, but it is a strong possibility if the employer ends up hiring too many Europeans and Asians among the pool of people who pass the exam. In effect, the employer is arguing that a yes-no standard of qualified is inadequate for employment decisions, a heavy legal burden. This situation applies to all certification tests: the Certified Public Accountant exam, bar exams, board certifications for physicians, qualification exams for promotion in police and fire departments, along with certification tests for registered nurses and K-12 teachers. A workforce may consist entirely of people who have passed the exam and still have large race differences in the scores of the people who passed. Since the examinations themselves are inevitably correlated with G to some extent, the result is differences in mean IQ of the sizes seen in Tables 6 and 7. I turn now to an issue that involves only a tiny proportion of the workforce, but has high visibility: the rarity of Africans and Latins in the most prestigious jobs in the private sector. That rarity is often used as undeniable evidence of systemic racism in the job market. Many of those high-prestige jobs are filled by people not merely in the top few percentiles of cognitive ability, but well into the top percentile. Recall the discussion of the width of the top percentile of a bell curve in Chapter 3. LeBron James is in the same percentile as starting players on ordinary college teams. The same phenomenon applies to an oncologist in an ordinary practice and the chief of oncology at a major research hospital. The former may be an excellent oncologist, but the latter has undergone a severe winnowing process that, among other things, has selected specifically for evidence of intellectual brilliance. Other examples of positions that select for extremely high cognitive ability are a full professorship at an elite university, a senior position in the financial industry, a senior position in the IT industry, law partner in a major firm in a major city, CEO of a major corporation. This is not to say that intellectually brilliant people typically have important jobs in a society. On the contrary, few do. But that a characteristic of people who rise to the top in every cognitively demanding profession in elite academia and elite organizations in the private sector is exceptionally high cognitive ability. I will operationalize exceptionally high as a minimum IQ of 135. High-prestige jobs in government and the nonprofit sector are also sometimes filled by exceptionally able people. But the rigor of the screening process varies a lot by job and organization. Why are there so few minorities in these high-prestige jobs? It's a numbers game in which the odds against a Latin achieving one of those positions are high, and the odds against an African are prohibitive, even if we assume that there is no racism whatsoever among the employers for high-prestige jobs. To illustrate, I'll use the cohort of young Americans ages 25 to 29, the age at which the potential candidates for such jobs are coming out of law schools, medical schools, business schools, and graduate STEM departments. In 2019, there were 23.2 million Americans in that age group. About 228,000 people in that age group can be expected to have IQs of 135 or higher. The racial distribution of Americans ages 25 to 29 in 2019 was more multiracial than among the older population. Only 54% were European, while 20% were Latin, 15% were African, and 6% were Asian. But that reduced dominance of Europeans in the total population doesn't make a lot of difference in the 135-plus pool. Employers seeking these exceptionally intelligent young adults were choosing from a pool that contained only about 2,800 Africans and 9,500 Latins, compared to 50,700 Asians and 160,100 Europeans. Uncertainty about these numbers arises because the standard deviation for each race must be estimated. As in the case of admissions at elite universities, we can assume that the most prestigious employers snag disproportionate numbers of the most talented new graduates. Given the number of employers and the sizes of the different racial pools, the inevitable result was that a large majority of U.S. employers that seek out new hires with 135-plus IQs had no entry-level Africans or Latins among those hires. 0. No matter how eagerly the employer solicited minority candidates, there weren't enough to meet the demand. Why aren't there more Africans and Latins in senior positions in the corporations and institutions that did hire such talented people? Again, it's a numbers game. Let's say that an elite IT company in Silicon Valley snags 100 new hires from the 135-plus pool in the racial proportions of the pool as a whole. That means 70% are European, 22% are Asian, 4% are Latin, 1% is African, and 3% are a mixture of races or other. What percent of new hires of any race in any company rise to senior positions? It depends on the organization and the definition of senior, but in any case, the 4 Latins are competing against 96 others and the 1 African is competing against 99 others to become one of the chosen few. Those are daunting odds. Unless you are familiar with race differences in cognitive ability, you might reasonably be convinced that the absence of African and Latin faces in the highest ranks of the American private sector means that you live in a systemically racist country. If instead you are familiar with those differences, and you still want to expose racism wherever it does exist, you will start your inquiries aware that it is inevitable that a large majority of employers of people with extremely high cognitive ability will have no Africans or Latins in those coveted jobs. Among those that do have some Africans or Latins, only a small minority will have even one in the upper echelons of the organization. These results will occur in the absence of any racism whatsoever. The relationship of differences in cognitive ability to job performance. Many readers probably have reached this point in the discussion with a variant on the question that they had after the discussion of test scores in Chapter 3. Then, the question was whether IQ scores fairly represent the cognitive ability of minorities. Now, the question is whether differences in cognitive ability translate into significant differences in job performance and productivity. What does it mean for the quality of customer service when one group of retail salespersons has a mean IQ 13 points lower than another group? What does it mean for children's education if one group of K-12 teachers has a mean IQ that is 15 points lower than another group? Results from job performance meta-analyses. We cannot answer such questions directly through meta-analyses because the studies of race differences in job performance seldom have measures of both job performance and cognitive ability. Rather, we know that IQ and job performance are correlated in analyses without regard to race. We know that people of different races in the same occupations have substantially different cognitive ability. Given those two knowns, it is reasonable to expect that the literature on race and job performance will consistently show that race differences exist, and in fact, this has been the case. The two most comprehensive meta-analyses are by Philip L. Roth, Alan Huffcutt, and Philip Bobko, Ethnic Group Differences in Measures of Job Performance, a new meta-analysis, published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, and by Patrick F. McK and Michael A. MC Daniel, a re-examination of black-white mean differences in work performance, more data, more moderators, published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. Their findings build on early synthetic analyses from the 1980s and 1990s, and are consistent with each other. These generalizations are well established. European-African differences in job performance are found for jobs at all levels of cognitive complexity, with a mild tendency for the size of the difference to increase with complexity. Objective measures of job performance and subjective ratings of job performance show roughly similar differences. On average, measures of performance related to personality, for example, prosocial behaviors on the job, showed small race differences. The larger the cognitive component of the measure, for example, job knowledge, the greater the size of race differences. The size of the European-African differences in job performance varies depending on the occupation and the measure. The Roth and the McKay studies both put the average at about a third of a standard deviation. These differences are consistent with expectations if the correlation between IQ and job performance measures is in the range discussed earlier. Generally, too, an intriguing bright spot is the military's record. A large 1989 study of performance ratings among Army enlisted personnel found that Europeans had a modest advantage over Africans on measures of task proficiency and job effort. But there was little difference on measures of discipline, and an African advantage on measures of military bearing. There was no meaningful difference on any of the measures for Europeans and Latins. The McKay meta-analysis, which was limited to the European-African comparison, included results from 5 studies of military personnel. The Europeans still had an advantage on work quality measures, but the combined measures of job performance led to an overall European-African difference of 0.09. In other words, a small African advantage. Results for the military stand apart from all civilian work settings and occupations. One relevant factor for explaining the military's success is presumably that each branch has its own minimum score on the Armed Forces qualification test required of all recruits. The Army requires a score at the 31st percentile or higher, equivalent to an IQ of 92.6 or more, which is roughly the top half of the African and Latin distributions. Presumably another factor is that military personnel cannot train for the military occupational specialty of their choice unless they have high enough scores on the relevant subtests in the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. Technically, there's no reason that civilian employers that used comparable procedures couldn't achieve similar results. However, doing so would mean basing employment decisions not only on an IQ cutoff, but also on aptitude tests, both of which run the risk of violating the anti-discrimination laws that apply to civilians. Results for specific occupations. Averages from meta-analyses don't tell you anything about specific occupations. Those numbers are hard to come by. I managed to assemble some bits and pieces. The details are in the note, but I can summarize the results quickly. Among accountants, race differences in the pass rate for the Certified Public Accountant exam are commensurate with the race differences in cognitive ability. In the legal profession, the race differences in pass rates for the bar exam are commensurate with race differences in cognitive ability. So are differences in the percentage of attorneys who have been the subject of repeated complaints in California. In the medical profession, race differences in board certification for a medical specialty are commensurate with race differences in cognitive ability. So are differences in investigations of complaints filed against physicians and in disciplinary action by the State Medical Board of California. For K-12 teachers, race differences among those rated minimally effective or ineffective in Michigan were commensurate with race differences in cognitive ability. I wish that I could give you more systematic, nationwide evidence bearing on professional competence. The evidence from the bits and pieces is given credibility by its consistency with the findings of the meta-analyses. But if nonetheless, the bits and pieces are misleading, it should be easy to prove. The archives of city and state agencies, legal and medical professional organizations, and the federal government contain voluminous data on bar examinations and medical board certifications, on legal and medical malpractice, on police performance ratings, on teachers' ratings, and on performance measures for other occupations requiring licensing or monitoring. There's no shortage of evidence that could confirm or refute my presentation. That evidence just hasn't been made available for public examination. As for the occupations that don't require licensing or monitoring, every major corporation in the country has detailed records on job performance. They know exactly how those records differ by race. If any of them has a success story similar to the military's, I hope they will tell it and explain how it was done. Systemic racial preferences in the job market. The usual way in which the media and politicians talk about race discrimination in the job market is to compare the percentage of Africans or Latins in a given occupation with the percentage of Europeans. This makes the situation look bad. The 2014 to 2018 American Community Survey found that Africans at 13% of the population accounted for only 3.6% of CEOs, 3.7% of physical scientists, 4.4% of civil engineers, 5.1% of physicians, and 5.2% of lawyers. Latin percentages in those prestigious occupations ranged from 5.3 to 7.6%, but Latins are almost 18% of the population, so their underrepresentation was nearly the same. The picture flips when race differences in cognitive ability and job performance are taken into account. Africans and Latins get through the educational pipeline with preferential treatment in admissions to colleges and to professional programs. Their mean IQs in occupations across the range from unskilled to those requiring advanced degrees are substantially lower than the mean IQs for Europeans in the same occupations. Race differences in measures of on-the-job performance are commensurate with the differences in cognitive ability. I think it is fair to conclude that the American job market is indeed racially biased. A detached observer might even call it systemic racism. The American job market systemically discriminates in favor of racial minorities other than Asians.